So we left off on Monday talking about arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. Okay. I want to point out a couple of things here that are going to be really important because, again, as we have hit throughout the class, there's some very special structures that help impart, especially in the arterioles, their function. Okay, so here's a large conduit artery, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins. So blood is leaving the heart out towards the tissues, right next to and adjacent to the tissues, bringing it back up to the heart. Okay. What I want to point out basically is there's some differences in the stuff that surrounds arteries and arterioles that is a little bit different and makes them unique in comparison to capillaries and venules and veins. Okay. And so I will draw this up here, and you guys should have all seen all of this before, and hopefully it will make sense because it's really important for cardiovascular disease. Okay. I've told you guys the story about my high school zoology teacher that would come in and draw a line on the chalkboard, and he'd be like, "What is this?" Right? If I told you all that story, like Serengeti Plain, Africa. So here we go. This, not a blood vessel. This, blood vessel. Okay? Blood vessel. Right now, could be an artery, could be an arteriole, could be a capillary, could be a vein. Okay? So on our arteries and arterioles, we have a special name, okay, for the lining on the inside. Okay. Anybody remember what is this called? The layer of cells that lines the inside. It's the endothelium. Very good. Okay. Okay. Then on the outside, out here, okay, in this layer out here, we have smooth muscle. Okay. So in these things, having that smooth muscle allows us to contract the smooth muscle and make the artery squish down like this, or the arteriole squish down like this, or we can relax the smooth muscle and the artery will widen out. Okay, and it will widen out. We call this process of making it small vasoconstriction, and we call making it larger vasodilation. And they are, in fact, one word. I just sort of ran out of room and wrote them as two. Okay. So arteries, and especially arterioles, have an ability to vasoconstrict and vasodilate. Right? Now, how many of you, the reason that all of this becomes important, okay? How many of you have ever taken a hose and tried to shoot your friends or your brother or your sister, right? Or at our house, it's your parents who are screaming at you not to, or the dog or something, with the water hose by putting your thumb over the end of the water hose, right? You want the water to shoot out, and put your thumb or your finger or something over the top of it, okay? When I do that, I am vasoconstricting the end of the water hose. I'm making it smaller. Why does doing that lead to the water shooting out fast or farther? Pressure, okay? It changes pressure. When you take something and you squish it down, you shrink the volume. Same amount of water in there. When you shrink the volume, it raises the pressure inside. So there's a higher pressure inside a vasoconstricted artery or arteriole than there is in a regular one or a vasodilated one. Okay. So when the pressure inside goes up, this is going to seem counter to what happens with our water hose. Okay. What is going to happen is, yes, as the pressure goes up, it's going to try to squish or squirt the blood out one end. But by vasoconstricting and raising the pressure, I shrink the pressure gradient from upstream. So if I take, right, and I just squeeze my brachial artery, everybody do this, everybody squeeze your brachial artery. If you squeeze hard enough and you close it down and the pressure goes up, the pressure in your brachial artery could get higher than aortic pressure or left ventricular pressure. And when that happens, blood can't get through, okay? Because the pressure gradient shrinks. When I vasodilate and I make it really, really big, the pressure falls. So the gradient, the difference in pressure from the aorta into that area gets larger. So more blood is going to want to move. Okay. So what we use arteries and especially arterioles for is we change their diameter to alter the pressure gradients between the left ventricle or the aorta and the tissue where those arterioles are. And so when we vasodilate an arteriole that leads to, say, muscles, the pressure gradient gets bigger, so more blood goes to muscles. When we vasoconstrict, say during exercise, the arterioles that lead to your digestive system, the pressure gradient shrinks, so less blood goes to your digestive system. Okay? And so in this way, we're going to use the ability of arteries and especially arterioles to change their diameter to control where blood flow goes in your body. Okay? And that's going to be the big thing. Now, you guys may remember from Principles in Health and Fitness that there's this endothelial layer. And the importance of the endothelial layer is that it can sense things happening in the blood vessel. Okay? It can sense things. Let's say the blood's moving through in this direction, like so. Okay? Blood is actually made up of water and a whole bunch of tiny little cells. Anybody ever seen people use a sandblaster to try to like strip paint off of a car or like side of a building or something? It's all of these little tiny particles of sand in there, and you shoot them out with all this water pressure. And even though like in the water, the sand is not that coarse or anything, it creates this tremendous amount of friction as the sand moves past. The same thing happens in your blood vessels. There's all of these little bitty red blood cells and white blood cells in your blood, and they tumble past and scrape on the endothelium. And so the endothelium can sense basically the velocity and the turbulence of the blood moving through that artery, that arteriole. And it responds, and it makes something called nitric oxide. NO. Not nitrous, not laughing gas, but nitric oxide. And that nitric oxide tells the smooth muscle to relax and cause vasodilation. Okay? So when you exercise or you do anything and it raises blood pressure, that driving pressure increases the velocity of flow through a vessel, then the vessel is going to hopefully release nitric oxide, vasodilate, slow the flow down, lower the pressure in there to allow more to come through. Now you may be saying, this is great, Dr. Black, why should we give a shit about this? Well, improperly functioning endothelium is the primary cause of cardiovascular disease in industrialized nations. Okay? When you eat, I don't know, a bunch of Doritos or something like me, you got a bunch of cholesterol in your blood, and you get little nicks in the endothelium, you deposit fatty atherosclerotic plaques that cover up the endothelium. They narrow the vessel, which raises the pressure. That's not great. They let less blood flow come through, but they also seal off the endothelium so it can't sense the changes in blood pressure, the changes in blood flow, so it can't respond properly. And that's in so many ways one of the primary root causes of cardiovascular disease. So proper functioning of the endothelium is absolutely key to our ability to stay alive, not just to send blood where we want to go. Okay, so that's the importance and the things you guys will encounter with the vascular system. Okay, so we call things in arterioles and then into capillaries microcirculation. Okay, there's microcirculation that goes to every muscle, or microcirculation that goes to, let's just say, your liver or your kidneys or your spleen or someplace like that. Okay, these smaller feed arteries, smaller arterioles contain about 50% of our ability to have resistance to blood flow. Okay. Again, sorry, back to physics. Okay. Resistance, when you talk about resistance in response to either electricity or the movement of a fluid, resistance means how hard is it to go from one place to the other. And so these smaller feed arteries, the smaller arterioles provide about half of our ability to either let blood come through or keep it from going through in some areas. Okay. Here is pictures of arterioles, of the arteriolar tree. You've got these larger arterioles, the primary arterioles, and then things branch essentially perpendicular to each other. It comes off, it branches, and then you get a perpendicular branch, a perpendicular branch. And the little bitty things you see in the background are capillaries. Okay. And so we can look at our arteriolar network. So you have all of this highly branched network. And you can imagine a scenario where I can constrict or dilate way down here close to the capillaries and control where blood goes, or I can do it way up here in the big ones and either get a whole bunch more to come in, or I can shut things off up here as well. And this is how we control where blood goes in your body. Okay. Okay. So one last piece that I want to show you guys, okay, is there's, in addition to sort of what we've got here that you can see, there's also some nervous system innervation onto these vessels. It's going to help us also control vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Here's a microscopic view of the smooth muscle, right? All of these little circular bands that look like the Michelin tire man. Okay, all of those, that's the vascular smooth muscle that surrounds all of your arteriole. Then they took this, they put some dye in that's going to get taken up by nerves, and then they essentially eat away all of the smooth muscle, and you're left with something that looks like this. And it's imaging of sympathetic nervous system input to the vascular smooth muscle. Okay. We call this a perivascular plexus, but it's basically just little nerves that are going to primarily release epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're going to tell that vascular smooth muscle to either contract or to relax. Okay. So in addition to responding to input from the endothelium, they also respond to input from the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. That's how all of this is going to work. So before we get into all of the individual mechanics of how those things change during exercise, I want to walk you guys through a little bit of the math about why constricting and dilating actually is going to have an effect on allowing blood to either move or not move. Okay. So we are now talking about the flow of blood, the flow of a fluid, the movement of a fluid from one end of a tube into the next. Okay. And so we're going to look at how this happens, and what it comes down to is the volume of flow in any vessel is related to two factors. Okay, it's going to be related to difference in pressure between the two ends of a vessel. So here and here, let's say I've got 120 millimeters of mercury of pressure on this end, and I've got 100 millimeters of mercury on this end. The difference in that delta is 20 millimeters of mercury, okay? The difference in pressure from one end of the tube to the other. Okay. Aorta, brachial artery. Okay. Aorta, femoral artery. Something along those lines. Okay. And so it's directly related to this. So the bigger the gradient, the more flow. It's also then inversely related to the resistance encountered between the flow. We'll talk about the things that are going to come into all of this. Okay. So you can look at this equation. Very, very simple. This is why blood pressure is so important. And this is why the size of the blood vessels matters so much. Blood pressure is equal to cardiac output multiplied by something called total peripheral resistance. Total peripheral resistance is just the net of vasoconstriction and vasodilation of all the blood vessels downstream of the aorta. Okay. How easy or difficult is it for blood to move through this system? So when blood pressure goes up, you can move more through. When total peripheral resistance goes down, we can move more through. And I'll show you guys the math of all of this. Okay. Here's how this relates to artery size, why changing the arterial diameters matters so much. Okay. So there's a couple of laws that are going to be applied here. They govern the movement of fluids. First is called Ohm's law. Flow of a fluid is equal to the difference in pressure divided by the resistance to flow through a particular tube. Okay. If we then take what's called Poiseuille's law describes the things that go into resistance. Resistance is these constants, so it's A multiplied by the viscosity of your fluid, multiplied by the length of your vessel or tube, divided by pi, it's circle-ish, multiplied by the radius of the vessel to the fourth power. Great, what does all of this mean, Dr. Black? Well, this is constant, viscosity is constant, the length of your vessels are constant, pi is constant. So really, we control resistance by controlling the radius of the vessel. And because it goes to the fourth power, any small change has very, very dramatic effects on resistance. So if you put these two things together, you get something called Poiseuille's equation, which tells us basically that flow is equal to the difference in pressure multiplied by radius to the fourth power. So if I make this smaller by just a little bit, it makes flow go down. If I make it bigger by just a little bit, it makes flow go up. Okay, so it's differences in pressure and differences in arterial size. Okay, that's the big thing. So a small change in diameter has a dramatic effect. You guys don't have to know these equations. You don't have to memorize these equations, but you do have to understand where radius comes in and why changing the diameter from normal to either vasoconstrict by making it smaller dramatically reduces flow, or making it bigger by making the radius diameter bigger dramatically increases flow. Okay. Very, very simple kinds of things. This is how we move blood from one place to the other. Okay. All right. So if that's how we move blood around, let's talk about where it is. Okay. Let's talk about where your blood is. Normally, blood goes to the most metabolically active tissues in your body. Most metabolically active tissues. So right now, you guys are resting. Many of you had breakfast. Okay. And so most of the blood flow in your body is here. Okay. It's going to your stomach, your intestines, your liver, and to your kidneys to filter it. Liver filters the blood, kidneys filter the blood. So you got a lot going here. Collectively, we call all of that the splenic regions. Okay. About a quarter goes to your liver, another quarter goes to your kidneys. Skeletal muscle is only getting a very minimal amount, about 15% or so at rest. Okay. When we exercise, we completely reverse all of this. We send about 80% or more of all the blood in your body to the actively contracting skeletal muscle. Okay. In addition to that, it goes to the muscles, and we increase cardiac output so much that the kind of combination of those two things means that muscles can see about 25 times the amount of blood during exercise as they do during rest. So it's this dramatic increase. Okay. Now, if you eat, blood wants to go to your digestive system. When you get hot and there is heat stress, blood goes to your skin. Okay. Blood wants to go to the skin to help us dissipate heat. This is why these things at times can be incongruent. Okay. You just ate, then you go to exercise. There's a competition between digestive system and muscles for blood. When it's hot outside, there's a competition between muscles and your skin for blood. And in a fascinating sort of piece of evolution, the muscles always win. Okay? The muscles always win. That's good if you want to exercise, but it's bad if you exercise in the heat. Because if you're really motivated, you can overcome and actually start pulling blood away from your skin and making sure it goes to your muscles, which leads to heat illness. It can cause heat strokes and those kinds of things. If you just ate, you pull all the blood away from your digestive system and it goes to your muscles, and now you got food stuck in your digestive system and no way to help kind of move it through, so you feel sick to your stomach. Okay. So there's this strange competition that goes on, and the muscles will, in general, the muscles have an ability to always win. Okay. So let's talk about the things that happen during exercise and how that interacts with our ability to vasoconstrict and vasodilate, so we can send blood to the muscles and away from other places. Or if you're at rest, send blood to liver, kidneys, spleen, and away from skeletal muscle. So there's two primary processes that are going on. The first is called autoregulation, and this is what we call local control of blood distribution. Okay? Everybody, arm out. Okay? Don't hit your neighbor in the face. Arm out. Okay? Curl. Okay? Curl. Keep it going. Keep it going. Let's go. All right? Curl. 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 Okay, stop. Look at your hand. Your hand in your redder. Does it look a little more flush than it was beforehand? Okay, so what we just did was auto-regulate blood flow to the active muscles in your bicep, and then your hand and stuff is downstream, so it's also going to get some. And you're like, that's great, Dr. Black, what the hell is auto-regulation? Well, the arterioles in and around the tissues that are increasing their metabolism will auto-regulate or respond to that change in metabolism and bring more blood flow into those particular tissues. Okay. And so increased demand for oxygen, increased concentrations of potassium, changes in pH to become more acidic, lactate, all lead to vasodilation. Okay. And what they signal is smooth muscle in those arterioles, relax, vasodilate, allow more blood to come to that particular tissue. Okay. It changes the resistance to flow. So for the same blood pressure, we're now going to get more flow to that particular tissue. Okay. In addition to this, the velocity of blood. So as you start exercising, blood pressure also rises. The left ventricle contracts more forcefully. Pressure rises. Pressure controls velocity of movement. And so as that moves, more blood tumbles by the endothelium, and that creates something like one of my favorite movies when I was about slightly older than Ellis. Okay. You guys are not nearly old enough to remember this. Has anybody seen the movie The Karate Kid? Yes. You guys remember Mr. Miyagi and the Karate Kid? Yes. Okay. Everyone do this. Take your hands, put them together, rub. Mr. Miyagi does this and he grabs Daniel and stuff. But you do this, okay? Do you feel it getting warm in between your hands? Yes? Okay. What are we creating? Friction. Okay. Shear stress in a blood vessel is friction. It's friction from the red blood cells scraping along the endothelium. They release nitric oxide and they say vasodilate. Okay. And so the combination of these things leads to vasodilation, which brings more blood to that particular tissue. Okay. So that's one of the ways that we get more flow and get more blood to that active tissue. And it happens almost immediately. Okay. The other way that we control things is something called extrinsic neural control. Extrinsic denoting outside. Okay. Outside. Not something from that tissue. Not something from that blood vessel in that one little area. Okay. This is where we make use of all of those little sympathetic nerves that are going to innervate smooth muscle. So, yes, sympathetic input is going to help us control blood distribution. You guys remember, when I start to exercise, what happens? Epinephrine and norepinephrine. So it goes up. Okay. Now here is what I think is a really interesting but somewhat mind-blowing concept. Okay. In certain tissues. Okay. In certain tissues. You want everybody stand up. We're going to try this. Okay. Everybody stand up. I'm not going to have you ask the neighbor a weird question. We're going to do that. Okay. Squat. Okay. Squat. Up. Yeah. Everybody work it out. Victor, you okay? Get that soreness out. Okay. Squat. We release epinephrine and norepinephrine right now. Okay. Y'all look so fucking pleased with me. All right. Stop. Okay. You squat. You release epi and norepi. That same epinephrine and norepinephrine causes vasodilation to your quads and causes vasoconstriction to stomach, liver, okay, and things like that. How does it do that? It's the same neurotransmitter or the same hormone. How do we get a completely opposite response in one tissue versus another? Want to guess?
One skeletal muscle, one smooth muscle.
Good idea, Joey, but it's actually the smooth muscle in the vessels that are going to cause them. What'd somebody say?
Different receptors.
Different receptors. You guys talk about different kinds of beta adrenergic and alpha adrenergic receptors in human phys at all? Y'all remember that? And their different G proteins and the different things that they're going to do, right? You're like, oh God, we're going to talk about it. Okay, y'all can sit. There are receptors, okay, all of which bind epinephrine and norepinephrine, but they fall into different classifications because they induce a different response. Okay, there are adrenergic or beta receptors, beta 2 receptors that when they bind epinephrine, norepinephrine, tell smooth muscle to relax and dilate. There are alpha receptors that respond to epi and norepi by telling smooth muscle to constrict. Okay. And so the difference in the distribution of these receptors in arterioles plays some role, in controlling the overall response. Okay. If skeletal muscle has more beta 2 receptors, less alpha receptors, whereas your digestive system has more alpha receptors and less beta 2 receptors, then that same epinephrine and norepinephrine will cause very opposite responses to the blood vessels in each tissue. Okay. And the cool part about this is that all we have to do is release one response, right? It's the same epi and norepi, but because of the differences in receptors, you get different responses in different tissues. So you don't have to send this to this tissue and something different to a tissue over here. It's the same thing. You just get different responses. Okay. So in that way, it's kind of cool. In most tissues, alpha receptors predominate on blood vessels. Okay. The general response to fight or flight or epi and norepi is vasoconstriction. Okay. And then you get vasoconstriction, and then we auto-regulate in a particular tissue to overcome most of that constriction. Okay. That's mostly kind of what's going on. Right. That's mostly what's going on. That's how all this works. And so this is how you start exercising and blood all goes to skeletal muscle and just the working skeletal muscle. And it stays away from other tissues. So we can focus all of that cardiac output, all of that blood and oxygen and things to those working muscles. Okay. Questions about that? Victor.
How does the smooth muscle regulate where the norepinephrine goes, which receptor?
It doesn't.
So
It's not guessing. It's not guessing. It's just like everything else. It's biochemistry. It's just there are, right, 70% of you in here are beta 2 receptors. 30% of y'all are alpha receptors. Everybody's eyes are closed. We let the next class come in. They're the epinephrine, norepinephrine. Everybody just walks around until you bump into something. It bumps into you, you're a beta 2, relax, right? It bumps into Los, alpha, constrict. It's just what happens. So it's all just about the distribution, like how dense are those receptors in that particular location. So you just dump the epi and norepi out and you just get what you get. Okay. Again, physiology is wild. Everything is a random chance reaction. And so all we're doing is just sort of tipping, right, the chances or the probability that the reaction that we need is going to happen. Okay. Okay. Y'all look bored. Am I boring you all today? Is it because it's sort of weirdly like dark and yet still and super humid outside? I would kill for a day in the fucking 50s. I would just kill for it. Like just one day, right? I mean, it's about to be November. 4 years ago, like yesterday, was like the worst ice storm that we've had anywhere.
Wow.
We've spent 2 weeks without power in arguably one of the most affluent part of the state. We were the last place that got power back. Like our block, our neighborhood, our house were like the last people that got power back. And of course, we had a 1-year-old at home. So I remember buying a generator at Lowe's, the like last generator that they had as the ice was coming down, and then figuring out how to run it. We had a window, air conditioning and heating unit in Ellis's room. It was the only heat we had in the entire house. And so we put her in there, we would run it, and then we'd plug in some little space heaters elsewhere. It was wild. So also hotels, modern hotels are not good places for little kids, right? Floating shelves are not made for 1-year-olds. So they want to grab things and pull shit down and all of that. So anyway, I just bemoan it's going to be like 80 again today. I'm just tired. I'm tired of it being hot. Okay. Let's talk about blood. Anybody squeamish? My wife is squeamish. If she sees blood, she's passing out. Okay. If you touch the crease in her elbow, she will pass out. Okay. We have to like spend a month getting bucked up for her to go and give blood, right? To have blood drawn. Okay. It was crazy. It's So like we spent like a month while she was pregnant, like getting hyped up to go get all the blood drawn for all the genetic testing and stuff that we had done, because she was a geriatric mother, and these kinds of things. Okay. She saw one of our dogs knock something off when like 10 years ago, and she was at home and I was at work, and like Truman cut his tail and was bleeding, and she was like, "You got to come home. Like Truman's hurt. Like if I go out, I'm gonna pass out. Like you gotta. It's wild." So anyway, I'm going to show you blood. That's the point of all of it, right? Okay. So to me, we don't spend enough time talking about blood, right? We talk about the heart, we talk about blood vessels, and we just make all of these assumptions that the blood exists and it works and it moves around, and it does. But there's a lot of stuff that is very unique to our blood and our red blood cells and our plasma volume and all of these things that help us have proper cardiovascular system. Okay? So blood is the place where we transport oxygen and CO2. So we transport gas in the blood. Okay. All the glucose and free fatty acids, all of our nutrients get transported. Excuse me. Waste products go in there. We use blood to dramatically help us regulate core body temperature. Okay. And then we use it to buffer and balance acidity in the blood, or everywhere in our tissues as well. If blood doesn't work correctly, we all die. Okay. Very, very fascinating, very, very important. I want to introduce a term called blood volume. Okay. Blood volume is all of the blood, all the red cells, all the plasma, okay, in your body. I used to bring 2-liter bottles to class on this day, and I'd put water in them, and I would put red food coloring in there. And people are like, okay, we get it, right? But most of you have somewhere between 4 to 6 liters of blood in your body. When you see it right there, like 3 2-liter bottles or 2 2-liter bottles in front of you, it doesn't actually seem like it's that much, right? In the midst of these. But that's about how much you have. Blood volume tends to be related both to body size and state of aerobic exercise training. One of the biggest responses to aerobic training is you add like a liter of blood in your body, which raises cardiac output, it raises stroke volume, it raises your ability to dissipate heat. It's really, really important. Okay? So that's blood volume. We'll talk a lot about total blood volume, but we'll also talk about what's going on with the individual cells in the blood. Okay. So here's a tube. We drew some blood from you. We put it in a centrifuge and we spun it around, and it separates. It separates because blood, although we see it macroscopically as a liquid, is actually water with a bunch of cells in it. Okay. And so the plasma is essentially the water that's in your blood. There's a little bit of other stuff. It's not just like pure distilled water, but it's basically water. In most of you, water in your blood or plasma accounts for about somewhere between 55 and 65% of your total blood volume. The majority of your blood is just water. Okay. Levels of plasma can change acutely due to dehydration. You go and you sweat a bunch, and the water that you're sweating out is primarily coming from the water in your blood. And then this is the thing, the plasma, the water in your blood is the thing that changes dramatically with exercise training. Okay. Now, also in there is a thing that we call hematocrit. Hematocrit is the cells, okay, which is primarily like 99% of your hematocrit is red blood cells. And then there's white blood cells and platelets that make up the last little 1%. Okay. For most of you, we talk about something called a hematocrit percentage. Hematocrit percentage is just what percentage of total volume are red blood cells as your total blood volume. Right. So hematocrit percentage of say 40%. That means 40% of your blood is red blood cells, 60% is water. Measuring hematocrit percentage tells us if you're a blood doper. Okay. All we would have had to do to know if Lance Armstrong was a blood doper, and he 100% was, was measuring his hematocrit percentage. Okay? Now, he was sophisticated enough to not ever get it so super duper high, that it would cause a red flag. But hematocrit percentage, if you go and you live at altitude, you live at base camp on Mount Everest for like 6 months, you might get your hematocrit percentage to right at about 50, maybe 51 or 52%. Okay. You guys, it's going to mostly be around 40. Okay. If I give you artificial erythropoietin to make more red blood cells, I can make it 55 or 60% if I wanted to. If I had you, anybody in here, anybody O negative blood type? Anybody know? Anybody know your blood type? Audrey, you are? Okay, you're everyone's favorite person. Every time there's a blood drive, you should give, right? The universal donor. Audrey could give us all a pint of blood. We could spin it around, pull all the red cells out, and then infuse the red cells into anybody in the classroom. And I make all of your VO2 maxes go up by about 20% just from that one thing. Okay. The other thing that I do though, when I increase red cells, is I make your blood sludgier. It gets thicker, makes the viscosity go up, which increases the chances you'll have a blood clot in the middle of the night. Okay. So there's some stuff that goes into. We'll talk about what training and things do to the plasma and to hematocrit in the blood. Okay. So the thing that makes the hematocrit so important is that it is 99% red blood cells. We call them erythrocytes, and we use red blood cells to transport oxygen. That's the primary thing. Okay. Our ability to live and function the way that we do is all down to red blood cells. Okay. In a red blood cell, you have hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has iron in it. Iron is very, very, very strongly positive. Iron loves oxygen. Okay. Loves oxygen. You put 4 molecules of oxygen on every hemoglobin. There's about 250 million molecules of hemoglobin on every red blood cell. You have, okay, therefore, billions of molecules of oxygen in your blood. This ginormous ability to bind and carry oxygen. Okay. And that keeps this high gradient, lots of oxygen in arterial blood, which lets us force a bunch of it into tissues that we're going to. Okay. Anybody anemic? Shocked that it's only the ladies that are going to say that they're anemic. Tends to be a thing, especially in more petite women. My wife is often judged to be anemic. You guys take iron supplements? Okay, y'all are like, no, not going to be all of that. Okay. If you're anemic, you don't have enough red blood cells, the ones that you don't have don't always work. Any chance you have anybody that has sickle cell or sickle cell trait? Anybody know? Okay. There are several professional athletes that have sickle cell, or they have sickle cell trait when they go to Denver. It's in the NBA. They won't play against the Nuggets. They won't play against the Broncos and those things because if that happens, you can't bind as much oxygen. It becomes really, really dangerous. Okay. And so having proper function here is going to really be helpful. Okay. All right. We'll stop here. On Friday, we'll cover the cardiovascular responses to exercise. Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. Right now, y'all want test Wednesday or Friday of next week? Friday. Okay. Friday it is. Friday it is. Of course, Vic.
I take a little more time to answer, so I didn't ask it. Talking about